I've organised this debate today, Mr Turner, to call on the government to implement the Down Syndrome Act, because it was 3 years ago, members of the House will be interested to note, that it received royal assent. So here in the Mother of Parliaments, an Act of Parliament was passed with the democratic engagement of everyone across the House, and 3 years later, it still hasn't been implemented. And therefore, it is about time that it was, because we need it. The first requirement, the first command of that Act was that the government should issue guidance because of the specific needs of people with Down syndrome. It should issue such guidance in order to guide local authorities, health authorities, education authorities, everyone, in fact, engaged in the support of people with Down syndrome. Mr Turner, the various versions of draft guidance have been produced, but none have been even complete in the coverage of that which is required, let alone have any of them been adequate. In 2022, the then Minister for Care and Mental Health, the previous member for Chichester, assured us, and I quote, that this guidance would be fit for purpose so we can ensure people with Down syndrome can access the support they need. And the final guidance will be published next year. Well, the previous government did not fulfil that pledge, and we sit here today with people with Down syndrome still not seeing this historic act fully in force. As I say, the versions so far, my understanding, and I don't claim any great expertise, Mr Turner, but my understanding of the versions so far is that they have been flawed in a number of ways. Instead of recognising the unique needs of people with Down syndrome, the draft versions of the guidance reduce it simply to a type of subset of a type of learning disability. And this limited perspective does a disservice to those with Down syndrome. For instance, individuals with Down syndrome often require tailored speech and language therapy, yet the most recent version of the guidance, published in December, only makes vague references to specialist therapy. My friend, former member, the Right Honourable Sir Liam Fox, who was the driving force behind the Act, put it perfectly. And I quote, "This legislation was specifically, Mr Turner, for those with Down syndrome, as a definable collection of predictable medical conditions with specific life challenges." And the Act itself reads, "to make provision about meeting the needs of persons with Down syndrome and for connected purposes." In trying to cater to all individuals with learning disabilities, the guidance misses the mark, failing to provide for the very people it was meant to support when it received royal assent 3 years ago. There are, however, Mr Turner, you'll be pleased to learn, reasons to be optimistic, because the Prime Minister, quite rightly, has pledged to lead a government of builders, not blockers. So we can all stand united, I'm sure, across this chamber, with MPs from all political backgrounds, showing a shared consensus that this guidance needs to be built, it needs to be issued, and we need to get blockers out of the way. We can have an agreement that people with Down syndrome must be recognised as having specific needs, not just generic ones, and that support must be in place to ensure they have equal access to opportunities to thrive in all aspects of life. What is truly disappointing is that the blockers of progress are not really elected representatives or indeed ministers, but I fear civil servants, those entrusted with carrying out the will of Parliament. And I think too many have obstructed efforts by ministers from 2 different governments to implement this Act. Despite repeated promises, we still haven't seen the creation of an effective cross-ministerial task force. And I hope the Minister may be able to comment on that, because if there is blockage, if there's resistance within the government machine, then it needs ministers to come together. Perhaps doesn't need to be some permanent task force, but 1, 2, perhaps 3 meetings maximum. Get together, make sure that the will of Parliament is brought to fruition. Engagement with key stakeholders has been less than adequate. When the stakeholder group was formed to lead on this work, there was no consultation with Sir Liam Fox, the sponsor of the bill. Of or Rachel and Ken Ross, the founding officers of the National Down Syndrome Policy Group, who also should have been included and who are a driving force behind the thinking of the bill. And I don't think that's good enough, and it's not a party political point. The Prime Minister has my full support to ensure the Minister here today and her colleague are empowered to do what they were partly appointed to do, which is fully implement this Act. I will, Mr Turner, say a little bit more about Down syndrome. What exactly is it? Down syndrome is a genetic condition caused by a chromosomal anomaly. While most people have 46 chromosomes, individuals with Down syndrome have 3 copies of chromosome 21 in each cell rather than 2. There are an estimated 47,000 people living with Down syndrome in the UK, making it the most common chromosomal condition. People with Down syndrome are achieving, the good news is, Mr. Turner, people with Down syndrome are achieving more than ever before, attending mainstream schools, gaining meaningful employment, making invaluable contributions to our communities, as well as living longer. But, Mr. Turner, there's a risk that we might see this progress as a reason to rest on our laurels. Instead, it shows the huge potential that people with Down syndrome have if only we could unlock it, and the urgent need to do more. There should be no limit to our ambitions for people with Down syndrome. That's why we shouldn't wait one more day than we need to deliver the guidance promised in the Down Syndrome Act. The first step, Mr. Turner, towards meaningful change is the improvement of healthcare. People with learning disabilities die on average 24 years younger than those without, and are twice as likely to die from treatable conditions. So whether due to significant delays in diagnosis, unsafe hospital discharges, or poor coordination between the NHS and other services, one thing is clear: many of these deaths are preventable. Now, doctors certainly don't mean to harm people with Down syndrome. Instead, it's likely that poor health care results from a lack of specific knowledge and training needed so that they can give people with Down syndrome the tailored support that condition requires. Following the passage of the Act, NHS England issued statutory guidance in 2023 mandating that every integrated care board appoint a named executive lead at board level to drive better outcomes for people with Down syndrome. This was because to provide accountability within the system. So people say, well, the ministers are responsible, not civil servants. Actually, in the implementation, in the delivery on the ground across the country, of course it's civil servants who are responsible, Mr. Turner. That's why it was the explicit part of the campaign around this Act and an explicit promise from a minister at the dispatch box that we would see people appointed, not so they could be hidden, but so they could be publicly available, so they could be contacted, they could be asked what they're doing within their area, not only to challenge the health system, but to challenge schools on what they were doing, why there was in so many parts of the country, automatically a Down syndrome child is assumed to need to go to a specialist school, when a lot of the evidence is they do better in mainstream, but only, of course, if the people in the schools have been given the support and the skills in order to deliver that improvement. Yet, when I sought a few days ago, Mr. Turner, to find out these named accountable individuals to allow the Down syndrome community to hold the government and the system to account, of the 42 ICBs in England, I was only able to find 3 with a publicly nominated lead, and 2 of them are called David Jarrett. So, Minister, can I ask what is going on? Can we make sure that these are publicly named, they are prominent on their website, that lists are issued, they are kept up to date, and everyone in the Down syndrome community can easily find out who it is that is responsible for the delivery of these services and is there to make sure not only health, but the wider community of public services is a servant to people with Down syndrome rather than turning that Down syndrome person into a supplicant. Next up, after healthcare, of course, is education, which is crucial to the life chances of people with Down syndrome. Research suggests, as I've said, that people with Down syndrome most often achieve better outcomes if they're in mainstream education, provided it's appropriate for their specific needs compared to those in specialist schools. Now, while officials in the Department for Education are best placed to offer guidance on this, it highlights the importance of an effective cross-ministerial task force, because we all know what it's like, and the Minister will have discovered this already in her relatively short time as a Minister, is other departments, that, where it wasn't made here, tend to be quite resistant. And the only way to cut through and make sure that sufficiently senior civil servants take on board actual acts of Parliament and do what they're obliged to do on a statutory basis, sometimes is for ministers to be called together, issue such instruction and push the system to do what it is supposed to do. Otherwise, they will sit in their own lane, following the particular priorities of the particular Secretary of State in that department, utterly ignoring their obligation, yes, their statutory obligation, to deliver on an act of Parliament. So, while some progress has been made, there is more to do. Statistics from NHS Digital reveal that only 6% of working-age adults with learning disabilities who receive long-term social care are employed. In other words, 94% aren't. When you meet the people who are and you see what they can do, you realise how many more are there? If only we put in place the right coordinated system, how many more could have much more fulfilling lives? Get the incentives aligned, because right now, if there are fears about losing benefits, it may be not the Down syndrome person themselves. They may not even be spoken to. Could be members of their family. Could be the social worker decide, oh, it's best just take no risks, keep them on benefits, rather than supporting them into a job where they can be full members of society and contribute and benefit from that activity. Even more troubling, 68% of those employed work less than 16 hours a week. And these figures aren't just numbers, they reflect the deep systemic barriers that still limit opportunities for people with Down syndrome in the workforce. Despite a range of initiatives, it's clear that we need stronger, sustained efforts to ensure people with Down syndrome can access fulfilling long-term employment. Only then will we truly break down the barriers to their independence and potential. So I hope that it is by now clear to the Minister why we must break down these barriers, and why it's critical that the will of Parliament, in the form of an Act of Parliament, 3 years old, really is upheld and implemented, and that change is delivered without further delay. The time for action is now, so I would be grateful if the Minister was able to answer some of the following questions. When will the cross-ministerial task force that was promised be created? At the very least, if she could speak to her colleague and push to have one. I know, colleagues, it's very hard to get ministers to turn up for some other department's cross-ministerial task force, so it often takes personal contact, an agreement that it's not going to run on forever, but say, look, this is important, let's get this over the line, please come along, get the right minister at the right time, sufficient seniority around the table with a real will to enact change and make a difference. If that could come out of today, that would be fantastic. Can she ensure that the consultation group contains only Down syndrome specific organisations to ensure that legislation supports people with the condition as is set out in the Act? There's been a tendency to open it up to everyone engaged in learning disability in terms of consultations so far. You have people who, with little or no understanding of the specifics of Down syndrome, who've been engaged in the consultations run by civil servants, and the whole thing has kind of has come into the ground and lost its specific focus as provided for by the Act. I've been informed by the National Down Syndrome Policy Group that the draft guidance issued to sector groups contains significant omissions. So would the Minister commit, and I always found it much easier to commit to meetings on behalf of colleagues than I did for myself, so I hope I can tempt the Minister to do so now, commit to a meeting with Rachel and Ken Ross, which I would also love to attend as soon as possible. They are the founding officers of the National Down Syndrome Policy Group, and they do exceptional work for people with Down syndrome, and they are in the gallery today, alongside Millie, who was gave evidence recently to the all-party parliamentary group, and is always available to correct any of us when we get our policies wrong, as Millie can surely attest. Can the Minister provide a clear date, an aspiration from the government, given it's been 3 years? When can we get this guidance so it's comprehensive? When can we get it ready in a final version to go through all the sign-off processes of government? And when can we look for it to be officially issued? These are not just procedural questions, they're vital to ensuring that the promises made to people with Down syndrome are delivered, and that we move forward with the urgency and specificity that this issue demands. Minister, every MP in this chamber, and they'll speak for themselves, but I'm sure stands with you in making this effort. And on behalf of the 47,000 people with Down syndrome across the country, we urge you to ensure that a suitable and proper version of this guidance is quickly produced, one that truly reflects the experiences and needs of people with Down syndrome, and specifically people with Down syndrome. If someone alongside this exercise wants to produce separate guidance that's more generic, fine. But can we make sure that the guidance identified in the Act is delivered for people with Down syndrome, and that it's published and fully implemented without delay? So there's a great opportunity ahead for all of us, Mr Turner. We can be part of delivering meaningful, lasting change for thousands of people, both now and for generations to come. And I hope, with the support of colleagues, which I'm sure will be there from across the chamber, that, Minister, we will send you out today determined to make sure your colleague does the right thing. Thank you very much.